How are you guys?
Doing well, doing well. A lot of buzz in this part of the country as Ole Miss is opening up SEC play this weekend after a light start to the season with the first 4 games they've played. Schedule for Kentucky has been a little bit different given that they've already hosted Kentucky, but first road game of the year. John, I look at this Kentucky team and I just don't know what to make of them yet. Right? I mean, we saw the blowout against Southern Miss in a weather-shortened game. We saw a blowout loss to South Carolina. We saw them play just tooth and nail with Georgia. And then you've got the Ohio game last week, which I don't know that tells us anything. You've seen this team. What do you make of them?
Yeah, I don't know that I know either, for sure.
Okay.
I think the defense is legitimately good. That being said, they have not played an up-tempo offense, anything close to what they're going to see with Ole Miss this week. So they could be good and still give up points this weekend. The offense, though, I'm not sure we know anything at this point because we do know that the pass protection is not good, and that's been their Achilles heel to date. It was a huge issue against South Carolina. The last 2 weeks, they have done a few things to scheme around that a little bit and try and find some different ways to get Brock Vandagriff, the Georgia transfer at quarterback, a little more time to throw. He's also, getting some valuable reps. He's a guy who's former 5-star recruit, but hadn't played in 3 years, and so he's looked like that at times. So that part of it is still a work in progress. The run game's been good, but that's I don't know that we can count on that to be to carry through the season if they don't have any sort of competent passing attack. So for me, that's the question: is if the defense can keep this game in the 30s, can Kentucky even score enough points to hang then? I don't know that we know that yet.
On that defensive side, I think the conversation, certainly the preseason conversation, starts with Deion Walker. He is just an absolute man at 6'6" and nearly 350 pounds, but he moves like a guy a whole lot lighter than that. Tell us a little bit more about Walker, but also the rest of that defensive line, which is, I think it's a really, really solid group up front.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Deion obviously gets all of the attention, both from press people like us, media people, and then also from opponents. So his numbers through 4 games probably are not what they were last year, and you might look at it and say, oh, has he been a disappointment? Well, that's mostly just because teams have been double and triple teaming him at times, which frees up opportunities for his other teammates, and they're good enough to take advantage of those. He's a guy who's listed at 6'6", 345, played basketball in high school in Michigan. Was really, I think that's where a lot of his mobility comes from. There's a play, if you want to know the Deion Walker experience, against Florida last year where they actually dropped him in coverage, and he just absolutely leveled a receiver as he was going to, catch a short pass like a running back over the middle, popped it in the air, and one of his teammates intercepted it. He can do crazy things like that. That being said, at his size, it's a toll on him to play 95% of the snaps is what they're asking him to do now, especially against a tempo team like Ole Miss. We'll see how his conditioning holds up. But he is a legitimate, first-round draft pick. And the other guys around him are not quite that good, but they're not any slouch. I mean, Trevon Ripka's a senior, redshirt senior defensive end who's got a lot of opportunities and looked good this year. Octavius Oxendine on the other side, Keyshawn Silver, a former 5-star recruit who transferred from North Carolina, is their nose guard. Then on the edges, guys like J.J. Weaver, who's back for his 6th season, add some elements of the pass rush that maybe we haven't seen for a while in Kentucky too.
John, is it clear cut who the best corner on this team is?
Yeah, it's Maxwell Hairston. I mean, okay. He tied for the SEC lead in interceptions last year. That stat, it can be a little deceptive. I think certainly he is great at creating those kind of havoc plays, and maybe still has some plays where he's a little lackadaisical and at least in mistakes at times. But he's I think the Athletic has him as a top 60 draft prospect for the draft, so he is a legitimate prospect there. But that also says as much about the other guys because the spot opposite him was probably the biggest position battle going into the season, and those guys have played okay through 4 games, but we have not seen them tested a ton, and obviously not anything like they're going to be tested this week.
Well, and the reason I ask that question, there are different strategies that exist when you have an elite cornerback. Sometimes coaches or defensive coaches will identify a matchup and say, hey, you're gonna move with this guy. So in the case of Trey Harris, wherever Trey Harris lines up, you're going to line up on him, assuming it's on the outside. But there are other defenses that go with a strategy of, hey, we've got a field corner and a boundary corner, and we're not going to vary that, and we know we're going to get some matchups, and we know other teams are going to scheme. What does Kentucky generally do with Maxwell Hairston? Do they leave him field or boundary, or are they going to let him roam a little bit and maybe try to continue to match him up with Trey Harris throughout the course of the game?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think certainly traditionally, as we're talking about Mark Stoops and Brad White defenses, their defensive coordinator, it's more the latter, where they just stick guys in their spots and try and scheme around it, and they don't do a lot of moving. They typically don't even play a ton of man coverage for that reason. It's a lot of zone. They have still managed to send a lot of defensive backs, a lot of corners to the NFL, even without putting a lot of that on film. But there was talk going into this year they were going to play some more man, and we've seen some of that. Through a few games. They've also, some of their higher profile mistakes on even in these performances where they've been really good, like the Georgia game comes to mind. They played that as well as you could possibly have hoped until the very last Georgia drive. And then Maxwell Hairston and one of the safeties got confused about whether they were playing man or zone, and it opened up like a 30-yard game for Georgia. They gave them a first down and essentially ruined Kentucky's chances of getting the ball back. So there have been big moments like that. That being said, when you have a receiver as good as Harris for Ole Miss, I don't know that you can risk matching him up against J.Q. Hardaway or Jansen Dunn or DJ Waller or the other options out there who are just not very experienced. That's going to be a real risk for them. So I'm interested to see that strategy as much as anything this weekend.
Well, and I guess the other part of that is, how does Juice Wells fit into the equation? Because Ole Miss, they are fortunate from the standpoint that they've got two legitimate number one SEC-type receivers, and it's like, okay, there's the whole pick your poison thing. But it's pretty clear that Trey Harris is kind of the leader of that group. I was just curious if you had a good idea about that. There was the off-season stuff with Texas A&M, and there were a lot of people that felt like that left a bad taste in fans' mouths and maybe even with players, and people were really quick after the South Carolina game to go, this team, he's about to lose this team. They haven't forgotten that. Do you feel like that's an issue that's ongoing with this team, or is that really in the rearview mirror and just something for fans and stupid media people like me to ask questions about?
I don't think it's an issue in the locker room at all. It's certainly an issue in the fan base and for what the perception of Mark Stoops is right now, and the pressure on him to prove that they can even maintain their recent success in this new look SEC, and B, let alone take another step forward, which is what fans want. So like that part of the conversation is going to be there anytime there's a South Carolina performance like that. In terms of the players in the locker room, I've never gotten the impression that they were super offended by it. I mean, Deion Walker, the guy we were just talking about, was probably the one who had the most at stake there. And, he told us back in the summer at SEC Media Days, like, I was texting him all night trying to figure out what was going on and where things were going. And one of the first calls Mark made as soon as it figured out it wasn't going to work out was to Deion to say, I'm staying, stay here, whatever. So I think in this transfer portal era with NIL and everything else, as much as ever, they all look at it as a business decision. And so I don't think that they were offended. And frankly, the way that played out, I think we all suspect that it was A&M who pulled out. But it was vague enough that Mark got to go to his team and say, look how much I care about you. I'm sticking around. I'm staying at Kentucky. You should stay here too.
Spin, baby, spin. I love it. Love it. Yeah. Just a couple of minutes left with Jon Hale from the Lexington Herald-Leader. Brock Vandegrift. With the kind of up and down for the offense, it's almost easy to look at him and be like, but is he getting enough help, especially from the offensive line, to fully display what he's capable of?
No, I mean, definitely not. I mean, certainly Brock has had his own mistakes and has looked at times like a guy who's not played in 4 years. Like, he has not been blameless in this. But, like, that South Carolina performance was just terrible all the way around, and Mark Stoops came out Monday afterwards and said, like, you can't judge Brock on that. 75% of those plays, we did not even give him a chance to get the ball off. And so then it got to a point where even the plays where they did have enough time, it was in his head, and he was seeing ghosts, per se, there in the pocket, and that's something he's going to have to deal with. He's been better about that the last 2 weeks, but certainly the pass protection has done him no favors at all. It's frankly very reminiscent of the last time Kentucky went to Ole Miss, and the offensive line was in shambles, and Will Levis got, sacked, fumbled twice in that game, and ended up coming away with turf toe that basically derailed his entire last season in Kentucky. And so they've got to avoid that situation with Brock Vandagriff right now. He's done some really nice things. He's made some good throws. He's looked especially good on the move, keeping plays alive. He can make plays with his legs. But he probably locks in on receivers too much, and certainly could get the ball out quicker himself.
Sure.
So it's a work in progress, but I don't think some of these lists that have already come out calling him a bust, I think that's probably too soon.
Jon, thanks so much for your time. Really